morning. How are we all? I have a wee proposition, if you wouldn't mind giving me a few moments.
Do Bekar, friends. Dwarves are without doubt my favourite fantasy race. They're short, stout, bearded, and grumpy. In my opinion, one of the coolest profiles in the army books are the Wargoat riders, and the Champions of Erebor on Wargoats, because what's cooler than a dwarf, right? Them riding on a massive goat. And these impressive beasts will take your stumpy 4-inch move dwarf to a much more respectable 8-inch movement. And they can knock down the lankier factions to size with the devastating charge rule. As a hobbyist and a collector, I really wanted to have a Butchers at this profile in action on the tabletop. However, with the Champions of Erebor now being sold as an entire set, and the Wargoats being sold in sets of 3 for £55, this wasn't really a project that I could just dabble in. In true dwarven fashion, and unwilling to part with my cash, to achieve my dream of throwing these lads horns first at the enemy, I would need to have a bash. A kit bash, that is. I'm Joe from Windrush Wargamers, and here's how I kit bash some Erebor Ram Riders, which count as Champions of Erebor on Wargoats, for less than half the price. The first point of call would be the trusty steeds. Fortunately, a few months ago I stumbled upon these. The Rambuck Raiders from Fireforge Games. These are heroic scale dwarves mounted on rams. Now before anyone says it, I am aware that rams and goats are different creatures. Rams are of course male sheep, but they're horned creatures with lots of hair, so they'd work really nicely as proxies. Now these fit together easily in 4 pieces, 2 halves, and then each horn attached separately. I don't have an Iron Hills army yet, so in my headcanon, these are Ram Riders from Erebor. With the mounts assembled, I would need some riders. For this, I reached for the Perry Miniatures Agincourt Mounted Knights. This kit would give me plenty of heavily armoured legs, separated at the waist. A kit basher's dream if you wanted to do mounted conversions. The only obstacle for me to overcome was the length. These are fully sized humans. The size of these legs would have to be reduced dramatically if they were going to be passable as dwarven. The solution for this was to simply snip away the upper part of the leg. This reduced the size, but also kept the stirrups on the lower leg intact. I have no idea how this worked exactly. I guess there was enough of the upper leg left to make it look like the waist had become the hips. Either way, I wasn't going to complain. Kit bashing is a lot like building a jigsaw puzzle in 3D, but there are no instructions and you're making the pieces yourself as you go. So I had the ram, I had some legs, but I needed to make sure that they fit. The Perry Miniatures horses were a lot more thinner than these rams, so the legs needed widening. I remedied this issue by pinning them in place at a wider angle. Working up from the legs, I now needed an upper body. This would need to be dwarven in scale and heavily armoured. So I reached for my Grimhammer Dwarf sprue. After clipping these off the sprue, I removed the legs and the head with a hobby saw. It's important to note that I'm not really fussed about matching the Champions of Erebor miniatures exactly. This is because the Hobbit trilogy went through production hell, and during the reshoots, the actors couldn't move around in their heavy armour, so they decided to scrap it for the fight scenes. So, as long as I gave them heavy armour to match their profile, I was going to be happy. Speaking of the Champions of Erebor, I would need their recognisable features. For this, I used the Plastic Thorin's Company set. I started with the king under the mountain himself, Thorin. I was going to need his most iconic bits, so his head was sawed off, and also his sword Orchrus was removed, along with the scabbard. These components were glued onto the body of a Grimhammer with plastic glue. I then put the king under the mountain to one side, and began working on the king's axeman, Dwalin. Much like Thorin, his head was removed, and I also wanted to utilise the single-handed axes from the set as well, so those were glued to the back. However, the King's Axeman couldn't make do with just 2 single-handed axes. Oh no, he needed a massive 2-handed axe. I couldn't just simply take this from the Thorin's Company kit, as Dwalin is instead armed with a two-handed hammer instead, so I decided to use one of the axes from the Rambuk Raiders kit. The axe head was removed and drilled out so it could be attached to the pole of a Grimhammer's hammer. It's at this point I should probably mention that the legs and the torsos were magnetised. This would mean I could switch out the Champions of Erebor with the standard Goat Riders. I then moved on to the first of the King's sister's sons. Feely. He received the same treatment as before. I clipped him from the sprue, and his head was removed and attached to a Grimhammer's body. Both Feely and his brother have access to a sword and the option to carry a bow. His plastic counterpart, however, doesn't have access to a bow, so I needed to utilise another kit. I could have reached for the Khazad-dûm Dwarf Warriors kit, but instead I chose the unreleased miniatures Dwarven Reclaimer set, just because I had them going spare. This has plenty of spare bits, including a dwarf bow, which was clipped away at the hand and pinned to the Grimhammer's forearm. The sword was one of Feely's plastic daggers, with the hand taken from a Dwarven Reclaimer's set. This allowed the grip to be longer and make the dagger appear to be a short sword. Pulling the old combat synergy now, we move on to his brother, Keely. This conversion was much more simple, as Keely's plastic kit comes with a bow and quiver slung over his back. I was able to make use of the Dwarven sword as well, pinning it at the wrist. With the Champions of Erebor started, I can move on to the standard riders. I was able to leave the Grimhammer helmets on, and I wanted to equip them with the War Spears to get the +1 on the charge. The War Spears were constructed using the lances from the Perry Miniatures Agincourt Knights set. But I wasn't crazy about the standard lance points, too human. I needed something a lot more dwarven. So I decided to use the lance points from the Rambuk Raiders kit. These are a lot more hefty, and they have this cool crossguard. For the posing, I wanted a mix of war spears at ease, and also braced for impact. The other arms would be stretched down as if they were clutching the reins. The Goat Riders have access to a banner, which could come in handy. So I decided to magnetise one of the right arms of the riders, allowing it to be switched in between a banner and a lance. The banner was taken from the Dwarven Reclaimer set, but if you wanted to give this a go at home and equip them with mattoxes, you could just keep the Grimhammer's pick hammers. It was at this point I started the painting process, knowing that I could paint them in segments. I wanted the rams to all be unique, so I pulled some reference photos from the internet and used them as a guide for painting process. It was super simple, using contrast paints to blend together different shades of the fur and the horns, and then tied them all together with an overall dry brush. With the 6 rams finished, they would need something to stand on. My Erebor army is based on green marble, which depicts the luscious interior of Erebor. I decided to follow suit with the rams. To achieve this without using an airbrush, I used these simple techniques. The first step is to cover the bases in green stuff. This would allow me to carve the floor tiles using some dental tools. Ensuring to vary the segments so the bases wouldn't get too repetitive. These were then primed black and covered in a dark green paint. To get that natural variation in marble, I began sponging on different colours, beginning with black. Next, I mixed a white and a green, and finally a pure white. The next step was to pick out the raised areas of the floor tiles, using that green-white mix from before. And then, using that same mix, I added some mineral veins. So far, it looks a little bit rough and doesn't quite read as green marble. So to give it that green hue, I mixed up a glaze of warp lightning and started slapping it all over. Not thinking about too much where it went, just allowing the glaze to blend between all the colours. The last step was to give it that shine of polished marble. I think that gloss varnish is a bit too shiny, so I settled on a satin varnish instead. When the varnish had dried, it was simply a case of snipping the paper clips that I'd been using as a kind of painting handle, but I left a few millimeters protruding from the bottom so I could pin the beast in place using superglue. I then jumped back into converting the riders. I quite often jump between converting and painting for larger projects. This ensures everything stays fresh and I don't get too bored. The outstanding task was to do some green stuff sculpting. Mostly I needed to cover the gap between the torso and the legs, as there was still some daylight between them. This might not be an issue if you don't decide to magnetize yours. Fortunately, however, my Erebor army has these orange sashes. These are to establish a unifying colour and to emulate the style of Renaissance troops. I made an Erebor army showcase a while ago. It's painfully outdated now. If you'd like to watch it, it should be linked in the cards above if you are interested. I left some overhang on the sash to cover the seam between the two kits. This would disguise the magnetization. When the green stuff had cured, the next job was to fill in any gaps and add in any details to blend those kits together, including the hair, hoods, the neck joins, and lastly, I sculpted the iconic crossguard of Orcrist. With those kits fully blended, I could move on to the painting. My Erebor army has black armour and the fancier models like the heroes and Grimhammers have a gold trim. I started with a base coat of gold and then I applied an all-over coat of grim black speed paint. This allowed me to come in after the speed paint had dried with a brush slightly damp with water and work the bristles into the armour. The water reactivates the speed paint and pulls it away from the highest areas, giving me a very simple gold trim with no time or effort at all. The rest of the painting was the standard base coat, wash, highlight, doing some more detail for things like the skin. The very last detail was Dwalin's Hardman head tattoos. For these, I picked them out with a fine lining pen. This was an absolute nightmare to film, so apologies. With the painting finished, the models were complete, ready to ram into the enemies on the tabletop. Here's how they look on the turntable. For those wondering about scale, here is a ram when compared to a Morgul knight. As you can see, the ram is shorter and thicker than his equestrian friend, and for me, this makes him the perfect size. These are without doubt some of my favourite conversions that I've ever made. The magnetization makes them so convenient, and I'm really relieved at how well they turned out. And I've got the rest of the Grimhammers, Thorin's Company and the Dwarven Reclaimers set to play around with. these should set me up for projects in the future. I mean, I could make some more Champions of Erebor, maybe some more Iron Hills proxies like the Crossbowmen, or maybe that ill-fated Moria expedition to accompany my Khazad-dûm army. Let me know in the comments below if you would like to see any of these ideas on the channel. Also, let me know if you've made any Goat Riders and how you did it. If you liked the video, please leave a like, and if you disliked it, you can leave a dislike as well. Check out the links in the description. I'm really happy to say that we made it to 1,000 subscribers, so subscribe if you haven't. And in commemoration of that, we've just made a Discord, so if you want to jump in and talk about conversions, feel free to follow the link below. Lastly, if you wanted to give us a little tip, you could use the Buy Me a Coffee link. It's not a subscription service, it's just chuck as much as you feel like you want to pay. It just lets us know you really enjoyed it and allows us to keep buying miniatures for conversions. I've been Joe from Windrush Wargamers. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, let me know what you thought, and I'll catch you in the next one.